Hello students, welcome to this class. In this class, we will be seeing how we maintain an observational notebook and what steps are to be followed in maintaining an experimental record book. As you know, while conducting any kind of experiment, it is necessary to keep a continuous record of what you are doing in the lab as also what you are proposing to do in the lab. And this comprises the observational notebook, which is a continuous record of the experimentation. A second part would be a formal recording of the experiment in a record book. And this is especially necessary because as students or as professionals, unless we have a record of the experiments we have conducted, it will be very difficult for us to go over it again as also refer to it for future use. Now first in this class, we will be dealing with the observational notebook. In any kind of scientific experiments, it is necessary to keep a permanent record of all the data, the observations, the procedures, and the apparatus used during the experiment in a very informal and point-to-point basis. And this is what the observational notebook does. It is important for a student to become proficient in keeping and maintaining both an observational notebook as well as a record book. This is not only for referring back and seeing what he has done and how exactly he has proceeded with the experiment, but such a practice will also help him in his future as an experimental psychologist. Because keeping a notebook or a record book scrupulously is not something that happens in a single day. It needs a lot of systematic practice, a lot of concentration, and a lot of precision and scrupulosity. And this is a habit you can develop slowly, and as you develop, it becomes a part of you as a student of experimental psychology and helps you in your future tasks as an experimental psychologist. Now, a laboratory notebook or an observational notebook is a permanent, documented and primary record of the experimental observations or what all happens in the experimental situation. Now, there are certain rules about how the laboratory notebook or the observational notebooks should be. For instance, it should be a duplicate page notebook, which has carbon copies which have to be submitted to the instructor or to the teacher once you finish the experiment, and you keep the original page with yourself. Secondly, all the pages should be numbered in advance and they should be bound together. No loose pages or no spiral pages are allowed, and neither can you pull out any page from the observational notebook. Thirdly, square ruled paper is preferred for graphing because many a times your observations may include graphs, diagrams and figures. Another thing that must be remembered is that all entries in the notebook should be made with ink. You cannot use pencil or any other means to enter information into the notebook. Also, if the entered information is wrong in some way, you cannot use a whitener or neither can you scratch it out with the pen. If the incorrect entry is short, you can actually draw a single line across it, keeping it in full view and writing the correct entry next to it. And if an entire paragraph has gone wrong, for example, you can use a simple cross to indicate that the paragraph has gone wrong and continue, because even these wrong entries are of importance in an observational notebook because it actually gives you a full account, one-to-one account of what happened in the observational situation, how your thinking was processing. And in fact, at times, even these wrong observations can give you a lot of insight when you look back into your observational notebook after a period of time. And if you can see in the figure, you can see how a single line is used to cut out a small incorrect entry and a cross is used to cut out a paragraph which was incorrect. Now, the first page of the notebook is left out for writing the name and the other details of the experimenter or the person who is using the notebook, as also the purpose of the notebook in short, what kind of experiments it is doing. Say, for example, the experimental notebook is for experiments in cognitive science, so you can put a title that this notebook contains cognitive science practicals or cognitive science experiments. A second page will of course contain a table of contents, where every experiment entered into the notebook will be clearly written. The title of the experiment will be written according to serial numbers, and the page numbers for each experiment will also be written very precisely, so that anyone seeing the table of contents can actually directly go to any experiment he wants seeing the page number. Now, one fact we should remember is that The observational notebook is a primary record of the observational data or the experimental data. Hence, it is taken for granted that whatever is written in is the experimenter's own observation. Now, in case you are referring some other source, it becomes very necessary to keep a reference of it so that a third person looking at your observational notebook knows that this part is referred from an external source and is not something which you yourself have written. Another thing you need to remember while maintaining an observational notebook is that any kind of observation pertaining to the experiment and during the experiment should be written in the notebook only. You cannot actually note it down on scraps of paper or some other things and then think that later I will transfer it into the observational notebook. Such a thing may even involve some kind of fines or some kind of punishment from your instructor, because the basic purpose of the notebook is that everything happening during the experiment must be permanently recorded in it. And as for any kind of record book or any kind of notebook, the observational notebook and its contents should be legibly and clearly written. They should be logically written, and logical groups and logical side headings should be put forward. Now that we have a brief idea of what an observational notebook should look like and how you should make the entries and the other processes for obliterating or erasing the entries and putting in new entries, we will now go into the process of actually recording the experiments in the observational notebook. Now, even before the experiment starts, your recording in the observational notebook should start. That is the pre-lab recording. Pre-lab recording involves a recording of the possible procedures you are going to follow in the lab in the prospective experiment. And a detailed pre-lab recording in short shows that you are fully prepared for the experiment and you know what kind of procedures are to be followed and what kind of apparatuses or instruments you will be using and what kind of steps will be taken. Now, in the beginning of the experiment, the first thing that should be recorded is the objective of the experiment. This involves a brief statement of the purpose of the experiment along with the basic principles involved in the experiment and the experimental procedures or methodology to be used. A second step would be to write down the reference or cite the sources on the basis of which this experiment is conducted. At times you do not need to write the entire source. You can even give a page number, something which refers, if you have a lab manual, you can give a page number from the lab manual which indicates that yes, this experiment which I am conducting today is based on the experiment given in this page of the lab manual. Or you can probably give a small reference of whose experiment you are replicating or of the basis of your experiment in terms of where you got the idea of the experiment from. Then you have to record the pre-lab procedure. This can be in the form of a flow chart or an outline where steps to be done first are written and then what steps will follow are written. So a stepwise arrangement which you can follow during the experimental procedure, and you can also use it to cross-check whether any steps are being missed out or whether any procedures or any aspects of the experiment are being conducted in a way that is erroneous. Now we come to a most important step, that is the procedure, the results and the discussion. Now it is best to enter the procedures of the experiment and the data that you obtain from the experiment as it happens in the experiment. No need of any high prose language or a very scientific language is not required. You can just jot down the proceedings in a very clear and legible manner, probably in a way that involves lesser time, just for a record that this is the kind of procedure you followed. Both qualitative as well as quantitative data should be entered. And wherever possible, it is useful to use tables, charts and graphs. And all these tables, charts and graphs should have some kind of explanation as to what that table means or what those graphs indicate and so on. Now, if the experimental work is done jointly, that is, there is some co-worker who is doing the experiment along with you, it also becomes necessary to record as to what part of the experiment was done by you as an independent experimenter and what part of the experiment was done by your co-worker, because this will give you an idea as to who did what and how the procedures came together for the completion of the experiment. Later, if you need to repeat the experiment also, you will get an idea of how to divide the experimental tasks between you and 2 or more co-workers. Now, calculations on the basis of the data obtained should also be included in the observational notebook. These calculations must be as brief as possible, should be followed step by step, and a simple explanation or a single line explanation for the calculations should be used wherever necessary. Now, if you are doing the same calculations repeatedly in the course of an experiment, it would be useful and convenient to actually explain one sample calculation in detail stepwise, and the other calculations and other data can be expressed in a tabular form. One thing to be kept in mind is that all the tables, graphs and charts should be legibly drawn and all the entries should be clearly written. Now we come to the next part of the entry in an observational notebook. This involves a discussion of the experiment. Once you have entered the data, both in terms of tables, charts or graphs, as also explained it to a necessary extent, it now becomes necessary to discuss your results. A discussion should involve both qualitative as well as quantitative explanations of the experiment, and calculations of precision and accuracy should also be involved. And if you feel that there were certain errors or lapses in the experiment, these should also be discussed in detail in the discussion. Questions posed earlier in the manual with regard to the experimentation and with regard to the topic of study should be answered adequately in the discussion. While entering data in the observational notebook is that your observational notebook is the primary and raw source of all that takes place during the experimental situation. Hence, it should include point-to-point information of all that occurs in the laboratory situation. Everything right from pre-lab preparation to procedure and to calculations and finally to discussions should be included precisely in the observation notebook. Now, when a teacher or a third person sees your observational notebook, it may be corrected or analyzed or marked on certain bases. The first is the pre-lab, because this is very important even though the recording happens even before the experiment starts. Because your pre-lab recordings actually show that you were prepared for the experimental procedure in advance. Another thing that is important is a legible presentation of all data, graphs, charts and their explanations, so that anyone looking at your record book has a fair idea of what took place during the experiment and what kind of measurements were made. Enough explanatory information should also be included, because a third person with your level of knowledge in experimental psychology and for the first time looking at your observational notebook should be able to gauge what kind of experimenter you are or what kind of experimental process took place. Finally, your laboratory experiment should answer research questions which are raised from time to time and should put forward some kind of fruitful results to the research question in consideration. Now we'll come to the steps to be followed in recording experiments in the record book. Now, once you have had a primary and raw recording of the experiment and observations in the observational notebook, you transfer it into the record book for permanent reference. Now, while writing in an experimental record book, a few steps need to be followed. Firstly, a brief introduction of the experiment or the subject matter of the experiment should be put forward, so that anyone reading this introduction has a brief overview of what was the background for the experiment or what characteristics or attributes the experimenter is studying and what is the basic nature of those attributes. The next step involves writing down the aim or objective of the experiment, which should be expressed very clearly and very logically in 1 or 2 sentences. After that, we come to the method, where the name, age and other demographic details of the subject should be recorded. Of course, the name of the subject can be abbreviated or some kind of coding of the name can be given so as not to reveal the real name of the subject to those who are reading the experiment. After the method, it becomes necessary to enumerate all the materials or apparatuses or instruments which are being used in the experiment. It should involve a very detailed reporting of all that is used, including questionnaires or other apparatuses, papers, pen, and every other detail of material that is being used in the experiment. The next step would involve a detailed explanation of the procedure of the experiment, which should naturally be explained in terms of steps in a stepwise manner, which procedure came first and which followed. A next part of the experiment would be naturally to put forward the results on the basis of the data collected. Now, as you know, most record books contain pages where one side is blank and the other is ruled. On the blank side of the page, you can include tabular representations of the data, or charts or graphs, or whatever means is necessary to represent the data in a very clear and logical format. And on the ruled side, you can actually explain these tables and write down the results obtained at each stage of the experiment in a very coherent and logical manner. The next step is the discussion of the results. Now, whatever results are obtained should be discussed both in quantitative terms and in qualitative terms, or in terms of what the experiment or research reveals to the experimenter, or what kind of questions the research experiment answers. Now, this should be put in a form that can be understood even by a layperson to some extent, or whoever is reading your experimental notebook for the first time. It should be brief, it should be concise, and it should give a quick view of what the experimental results mean. Finally, we have the conclusion, where briefly the results of the experiment or the findings of the experiment based on the data collected are explained in 1 or 2 sentences, which give in fact an entire summary of the results and findings of the experiment. Finally, of course, we need to give the references in terms of what kind of literature was studied before the experiment and on what kind of literature the experiment was based. Now, references cannot be written in any arbitrary manner, and since we are students of psychology, it becomes mandatory for us to follow the patterns of references put forward in the publication manual of the American Psychological Association. If you have a look at the slide, you will see a sample of the pattern of referencing that is put forward by the American Psychological Association. Now, if we concentrate on the situation in India with regard to the performance of experiments in experimental psychology, we have to take note of one fact. Now, the University Grants Commission, or the UGC in India, conducts periodic workshops for various academic purposes. In one of the workshops, it was pointed out that many departments of psychology in our country do not actually have psychology laboratories, and even if experiments are performed in the laboratory, they are generally taken up by students as a leisure time activity and taken very casually, rather than understanding the seriousness and importance of conducting those experiments and the precision and scrupulosity to be involved in the actual conduct of the experiment. Hence, efforts are being made to make experimental psychology papers and such kind of practical work subject within the academic discipline, which will be marked, or for which marks will be awarded to the students. And hence, it becomes very necessary for the teachers to keep an accurate account of the various observational notebooks and record books prepared by the students. They should regularly check all these observational notebooks after each experiment, and only when the observational notebook or record work for one experiment is seen as satisfactory, only then should the student be allowed to go forward and perform the next experiment or write down or record the next experiment. Similarly, marks should be awarded on different bases, such as the legibility and clarity with which the experiment is recorded, the accuracy and precision measures followed, the way in which the tables, graphs and charts are presented, that is neatness and accuracy both involved, as well as punctuality with which the record books and observation books are being submitted. A teacher should also make note of the various corrections and errors that are made in recording experiments either in the observational notebook or the record book, and only when it is seen as satisfactory, that is, it is seen that the student has corrected his mistakes, should he be allowed to go ahead and perform another experiment and go in for future recordings of the experiment. Thus, in this class, we have seen how important it is for students of experimental psychology to develop a habit of keeping precise and accurate observational records in observational notebooks, as also formally record experiments in the record book. We have also seen various steps involved in recording the experiments and the basic factors to be kept in mind while keeping such records. And finally, we have seen why it is important for students to take up experimental psychology and the experiments conducted therein seriously rather than as a leisure time activity. Because if you want to go ahead in any academic discipline, research is extremely important and the application of the research is extremely important. And for research and its application, it becomes essential that you have some kind of real record of what is being done. And this is provided by an observational notebook and a research record book.